In this lecture, we'll implement the second Lambda function that will receive a SNS event POJO. When this is triggered, it receives a SNS event. And within this event, we'll have records. So event.getRecords will give us records dot for each record, SNS record, define the logic we want inside an arrow function or a Lambda function. We need access to an object mapper so that as we get the events, we can convert them into the patient checkout event object. So let's define an object mapper. You can go to the first Lambda function, copy this object mapper line, come back, paste it right there. And inside this, use object mapper dot read value. And the source here is SNS dot get the SNS record dot get SNS will give us a SNS record dot get message will give us the string message that came to the SNS topic. The second one is the class type that we want that to be converted to. So patient checkout event dot class. Assign this to a local variable, hit control 1. Yes, first surround it with try multiple catch, hit control 1 again, assign statement to a new local variable, call it patient checkout event. So we have received the patient checkout event as JSON. We have converted it into a patient checkout event, and we can do whatever we want to it. If you want to process it further, you are welcome to do that. Let's render it onto the CloudWatch logs system.out.println checkout or patient checkout event. Patient checkout event. That's it. So it's that simple to implement the second Lambda function. The SNS triggers this Lambda function. We receive a SNS event. We are looping through the records in the SNS event. In the record, we have access to the SNS message itself. So get SNS dot get message will give us the message, which is JSON that you saw on the console earlier. It will have only one patient information at a time. Each message will have one patient information at a time. We are converting it back to patient checkout event, and then we are displaying it in the CloudWatch logs.